Welcome back to Yang Daily. I'll be your host, Alex Cheney, bringing you all the Yang news you need to live your life right. We've only really got time to go over the big stuff today. I hate leaving out any relevant news, especially Yang stuff, but the episode's already long, and that's the reality of not being able to afford to spend all of my time on it, I'm afraid. That said, there is plenty of big news to cover. Let's dive in. Quick shout out to our Tier 3 patrons, Peter Park, Shay Meehan, and Nathan Stankowski, as well as all our other patrons. You keep us all informed and engaged. If any of you out there want to join these advocates of humanity first and independent journalism, head on over to patreon.com/yangdaily. It would only take a couple of bucks a month from each listener to keep this podcast and community going and growing into the future. Now on to the news. As I'm sure you've all heard, the big news today is that Biden has officially signed the relief bill into law. Checks are expected to start shipping out this weekend, and as Eric Levitz put it in the title of his article, it's a big effing deal. There's too much to go over in detail, but big picture, the bill is estimated to increase the income of the bottom 20% of Americans by 20%, primarily from the checks and child basic income. It cuts poverty from 14% to 9%, and child poverty in half. These are temporary measures that we should very much make permanent. More than 1 million unionized workers would also have lost their pensions and will now get what they were promised. Indigenous communities will receive $31 billion, the largest investment in them in history. Black farmers get a bailout. $39 billion goes to preventing mass bankruptcy in child care centers. Local governments won't have to lay anyone off. And one big item that I missed in the relief bill is that Biden snuck in his improvements to subsidies and eligibility for health insurance to essentially create universal health care. It changes the subsidies from an income eligibility window of between about $12,000 to $50,000 currently to a more fluid system which covers any cost above 8.5% of earned income. In other words, no one has to pay more than 8.5% of their income for insurance, including if that income is zero. This sets a ceiling and also eliminates a subsidy cutoff cliff of the current system, where you can go from having about half your insurance costs covered to nothing just for making a bit too much money. The relief bill also includes making COBRA coverage for the unemployed temporarily free. It also offers financial incentives to states to expand their Medicaid coverage. Worth noting that it took years for Obama to get the ACA through with a filibuster-proof supermajority in the Senate, whereas Biden just got much of his healthcare agenda, along with the biggest financial relief in history, through in his first 2 months. Not an entirely fair comparison, but still impressive. As much as we'd like it to be even more, these are very big moves. As Claudia Sahm pointed out, despite the reduction in means testing threshold forced by Manchin, every round of checks in the pandemic has reached more people than the last. This round will be reaching adult dependents and anyone with a social security number. Between that and the amount, the checks have become increasingly generous. This is a good trend, and unfortunately, quite the opposite of the trend that the GOP Senate have advocated for. In fact, the Tax Policy Center did a comparison between the American Rescue Act and the GOP tax cuts of 2017 to examine where the money went, and it's quite telling. In the tax cuts, almost nothing went to the bottom 20% of Americans, steadily increasing with income, with the top 1% receiving the largest amount of all. The Democrats' relief bill was the opposite, with the vast majority going to the bottom 20%, steadily decreasing with income, with nothing at all for the top 1%. Also compare that to the CARES Act, passed under both parties, in which the people received only a small share of the funds, with most going to corporations and the rich. The fact that policy institutes have dug through this $1.9 trillion plan and found 0% going to the rich and the majority going to common Americans is quite incredible and telling of party priorities. Stuff like this is why I feel the urge to slap anyone who says the parties are the same. And many Americans agree. A New Data for Progress poll shows a very nice 69% of Americans, including a majority of Republicans, support the package, and every major investment in it has over 68% support. Even the state and local funding that the GOP have constantly maligned is opposed by only 17% of Republicans. That is wild. Furthermore, 67% support further bold public investments in infrastructure, clean energy, and manufacturing. Infrastructure bill, here we come. In other news, Merrick Garland has been confirmed as Biden's Attorney General of the DOJ. If you don't recall, he was the Supreme Court nominee the GOP blocked in Obama's last term. That will put him in charge of investigating a lot of what happened under Trump, including the insurrection. On the democracy front, the Republican-controlled Georgia Senate have passed their bill to repeal the no-excuse absentee voting, which they themselves enacted. Coincidentally, this comes just after mail voting was taken up by more Democrats than Republicans. Georgia residents can now only vote by mail if claiming to be out of town, disabled, or over 65. While the former two might be somewhat justifiable, the latter seems a bald partisan play at election rigging. The over 65 demographic leans heavily Republican. This law essentially makes it legal for elderly white Republicans to vote by mail, but not young diverse Democrats, and all in the name of non-existent voter fraud. Republicans are looking for election rigging? Well, this is what it looks like, restricting the rights of voters who don't vote for your party. The bright spot is that the effort to repeal automatic voter registration has failed. This was the entirely redundant and absurd law that we talked about a while ago, so that is good to hear. But it's more clear than ever that we need federal legislation to protect the federal Constitution's right to vote. And due to the broken hyper-partisan nature of our democratic system right now, we will need to eliminate the filibuster to get it. The GOP are making crystal clear they intend to double down on their game plan of minority rule. And I'm sorry to say, as it turns out, it's not just the Republican Party that's campaigning against HR1. The Green Party is joining in, though for better reasons. Green Party leadership have leveled some equally disingenuous attacks against HR1, such as claiming it will further empower rich interest groups, which is blatantly false, or criticizing it for not doing the impossible, like establishing campaign contribution limits, which would take a constitutional amendment. This is very disappointing. However, they do have one valid criticism. HR1 would raise the qualifying donations amount for public financing by 5 times, meaning that you have to raise 5 times more in donations before you can get your donations matched 6-1 by the government. The argument is that this will make it harder for third-party candidates to qualify, which is true and problematic. Lawrence Lessig, professor of democracy reform, wrote an article responding to every criticism from the Green Party. I recommend giving it a read in the links. His response to this is to say that it will disenfranchise third-party presidential candidates, but will make it easier for them to win congressional seats, and they don't have any chance of winning the presidential race anyway. I've heard from others that many states attach the ability to run for Congress under a party to that party fielding a presidential candidate. I'm not clear on what exactly those requirements are and whether HR1 would affect them, and I'm not going to dig into it because I don't think that it ultimately matters. Whoa, easy now. I'm not saying I don't care about third parties, quite the opposite. What I'm saying is that I don't think HR1 hurting the chance of third parties to win elections in the current system is really meaningful because in the current system, their chances are 0. The Green Party has been around quite a while and has nothing to show for it on the federal stage, and their power is not growing. The system is rigged in favor of the duopoly, with or without HR1. But here is what I will say. One thing I hadn't heard about HR1 is that it would not only match small donations across the country, it would remove the current limitations on campaigns that accept public financing. The Green Party criticizes this, but they are wrong to. This is a good thing. Right now, if you accept public donation matching, there is a quite low maximum cap placed on your private spending. The amount is far too low to raise enough to win a race, ensuring that no serious campaign will engage in public funding, leaving the viable candidates primarily funded by special interests. There's a valid argument to be made for limits on campaign funding altogether, but it would need to be on total funding, not just public, and that cannot be done with a simple bill. HR1's removal of those caps means that all campaigns can get public matching funds, giving small donors far more influence over their politicians, and that is good for third parties. Let's simplify. A third party cannot win without voting and finance reforms. These reforms will have to pass under the duopoly. To do so, we will need duopoly politicians to be loyal to the people's wishes, not rich special interests. HR1's public funding gives people power over politicians. Therefore, HR1 is the path to third parties. That's how I see it anyway. Hurting the non-existent chances of a third party winning right now doesn't fundamentally change anything. Putting people in the driver's seat of duopoly funding, on the other hand, will establish a pathway that leads to actual change, including the reforms to make third parties actually viable. I say go with the path that offers a chance of victory, and that is HR1. Ideally, I would say let's amend out of HR1 this raise to the qualifications. But if that fails, I do not believe that this is a valid reason to oppose HR1. Denying a chance for real change to preserve a false hope makes no sense. We can fight for a better solution for third parties and have more influence to do so with HR1. It is the first step that makes other reforms possible, and that step is to put the voters in charge so that popular legislation can pass. And speaking of empowering people, the recession has led one part of Alaska to lead the way again on UBI. Skagway, Alaska, instead of reserving CARES Act funds for municipal operations, decided to redistribute most of the money to residents in the form of a $1,000 a month UBI. Yes, a real UBI. The only condition was to spend the money locally, and it worked. The town's goal was to survive to 2021, and they have. But it's gone beyond that. Skagway's mayor says current circumstances have gotten residents rethinking the economy. Quote, "What's good for Skagway? Is it healthy to be working 70 hours a week when your kids are out of school? Or is it healthier to have an economy that is a little bit more sustainable, not only from an economics perspective, but a personal perspective?" End quote. Sounds like this UBI trial has the mayor thinking about a human-centered economy, doesn't it? It's unclear where Skagway goes from here, but this is an incredible development, and I hope that they'll find a way to keep a UBI going indefinitely. And the inspiration continues to spread. Chicago's Committee on Economic, Capital, and Technology Development just expressed support for a huge basic income pilot. The proposal calls for 2% of the city's Rescue Act funds, or $50 million, to become the nation's largest publicly funded guaranteed income program. Details on the plan have yet to emerge, and it's not a sure thing yet, but the mayor sure seems to be backing it, along with many council members. This would be a fantastic advance. If you live in Chicago, get in touch and let them know that you support it. And finally, I'm pleased to announce that the letter to Biden from senators calling for an emergency UBI has gathered 6 more signatures. Please give Senators Duckworth, Durbin, Merkley, Stabenow, and Schatz a follow and thank you on social media, or write or call them to let them know that they're backing the right horse. And if your senator hasn't signed yet, keep harassing them until they do. Recurring checks is the last hurdle left to achieving an inevitable UBI, gang. And we finally have a Democratic Party that is not trembling at the threat of inflation and is not afraid of unconditional aid. We are so close. Let's bring it home. And that'll do it for today's Yang Daily. Get your senators onto the EUBI letter, keep the pressure on Manchin and Sinema to ditch the filibuster, bookmark and share the HR1 article, the Alaskan UBI, and Illinois Basic Income Pilot, flood Congress with calls, tweets, faxes, and letters using the ResistBot or Income Movement Easy Contacts below. If you need help, consult Humanity Forward, the Income Movement Aid Database, the Mission Asset Fund, or United Way, and don't forget to Yang Daily.